In a lavish Boston penthouse, the businessman everyone admired for his success reveals his true face. Blinded by arrogance and poisoned by his lover's words, he raises a walking stick and brings it down without mercy on his pregnant wife. Her cries of pain shatter the silence as he convinces himself that he has everything under control. But he is unaware that every blow is being etched into the memory of someone who will never forgive him. His brother-in-law, the victim's brother, is already gathering irrefutable evidence, and in an instant, everything the magnate has built over years begins to tremble and collapse like a sandcastle against the waves. The chimes of Trinity Church echoed as Copley Square filled with the lights and music of the Boston Pops Orchestra. Amid the joy of the 4th of July festival, the apparent calm of one family hid invisible cracks. Eleanor Vance walked beside Julian Hayes, her hand resting on her belly as she nodded to acquaintances. She accepted well wishes and thanked them for every kind word, but she searched her husband's face for a simple affection she could not find. Julian responded to greetings politely, frequently glancing at his watch as if his mind were elsewhere. The city was celebrating. Eleanor wanted to celebrate too, though a faint premonition weighed on her spirit. She thought a quiet conversation would be enough to chase away the unease. He seemed to want to fulfill his obligation of being present and leave as soon as possible. They decided to sit on the terrace of the Copley Terrace Café to have a drink and rest. Eleanor ordered a latte and a water. Julian ordered a glass of Cabernet. The waiter jotted down the order with a brief smile and walked away. Eleanor took the opportunity to talk about the next doctor's appointment. She said the baby was moving more forcefully at night and that it made her happy. She then suggested a stroll through the side streets to avoid the most crowded area. Julian replied that he had an important meeting the next day and preferred to go to bed early. She nodded and did not insist. She focused on staying calm, took a sip of her latte, and breathed slowly. She caressed her belly naturally, like someone protecting something they love. From a distance, Chloe Sterling appeared, confident, elegant, with a broad smile she offered as she greeted people. She moved between the tables, stopping here and there to share a quick hug or a warm word with acquaintances, and when she looked up, she found Julian. The greeting was minimal. A meeting of eyes, a restrained smile, a nod of the head was all it took for the air around their table to change. Eleanor noticed it in that same instant. She heard no words but recognized the quick flash of a recent complicity. She lifted her cup, took another sip, and set the porcelain down carefully. She decided to observe Julian with serenity. He turned his gaze back to his wine, swirled the glass, and created a silence that, to Eleanor, said far too much. She told herself it was not the time for assumptions. She thought about finishing her drink and suggesting they return home without prolonging the night. She also thought about texting Arthur later to tell him she was tired. An older woman from her Beacon Hill neighborhood approached to congratulate her on the pregnancy. Eleanor spoke calmly about the doctor, her minor fatigue, and the first baby purchases. The woman took her hand and told her she looked beautiful, that motherhood made her glow. That affection sustained her. When the woman said goodbye, Eleanor turned her gaze back to Julian. He seemed more restless. He was looking toward the spot where Chloe had disappeared into the crowd. Eleanor suggested they pay and walk a bit. Julian hastily left cash on the tray and stood up. They walked together toward the center of the square. As they walked, Eleanor attempted a light tone. She suggested they choose names for the baby. She proposed a simple dinner with her parents and his when the festivities were over. Julian said he had trips in September and couldn't promise any dates. She nodded to avoid an argument. She remembered their first walk through this same square when everything seemed easier. Now she felt a void that had settled between them, one that words no longer filled. They entered a less crowded colonnade. Eleanor saw her reflection in a window pane and recognized the effort she was making to stand tall. Beside her, Julian walked with his chin high, his gaze fixed elsewhere. She took a deep breath and decided to try again with a humble phrase. She said she felt very tired these days, and that a quiet afternoon, without commitments, just for the two of them, would do her good. Julian replied that they would see. That they would see landed in her heart with the weight of answers that never arrive. Suddenly, Chloe reappeared near a group commenting on the music. It was a matter of seconds. Julian tensed visibly, their gazes held for a second longer than prudence allows. Eleanor saw everything and chose to remain calm. She placed her hand on Julian's forearm. She said she would rather sit on a bench for a moment, and they moved away from the main flow of people. He agreed with impatience. They sat down. Eleanor spoke of Arthur. She said he always asked about Julian and wished they got along better. Julian replied that he found her brother to be decent, though overly demanding. Eleanor chose not to argue. The square was still alive. Near the fountain, a lone saxophonist played a bluesy tune, his melody weaving through the evening chatter. A grandmother lifted her granddaughter to show her the lights. Eleanor watched the scene and let serenity reach her for a moment. She took Julian's arm again and suggested they return to the central area to say goodnight to the evening. They walked slowly. She tried to believe that the distance she felt was due to fatigue or routine. She wanted to grant her husband the benefit of time. She did not ask for explanations. She held back her questions. As they crossed the terrace again, Chloe stopped beside some acquaintances. The quick smile with which she looked at Julian no longer feigned coincidence. He tilted his head slightly, as if confirming a signal. Eleanor understood without drama. She knew it was not the time for scenes or reproaches. She chose to preserve her dignity and her calm. She approached Julian and told him it was time to leave. He nodded without looking at her. They reached the main archway. A clock tower struck the hour with a clean chime. Eleanor felt a shudder that did not come from the breeze. It was the intimate certainty that something existed in her husband's life that he did not share with her. She needed no proof or explanations. That night, she caressed her belly with a protective gesture. She thought of the baby. She promised herself care. She decided not to break down in the middle of the square. She held her head high. She took one step, then another, like someone remaking their center from what is essential. Julian walked beside her, unable to find a phrase to bring them closer. He glanced up at the clock and then looked away again. Eleanor said nothing more. She was not going to beg for attention or compete with someone else's smiles. She chose silence. In that silence resided her wounded dignity and a new strength she did not yet know how to name. The music continued, the applause returned, and the night grew without asking questions. As the festival lights shone, Eleanor wondered silently, what secret was Julian keeping? A whispered conversation can be sharper than a scream. Eleanor still remembered the coldness in her husband's eyes the previous night in Copley Square. The next day, she agreed to join him for dinner at a Back Bay restaurant, thinking that with calm, she could recover the sense of partnership she so desperately needed for her pregnancy. They chose a secluded table and ordered without rushing. Eleanor spoke of the upcoming doctor's appointment, the slight fatigue in the mornings, how much she enjoyed short walks. Julian listened with a neutral expression, barely nodding, without a single word to build a bridge. When she mentioned that the baby was already making its presence known with gentle kicks, he changed the subject with a trivial comment about work. Eleanor realized she was hitting an invisible wall. She decided to maintain her composure, to prolong the conversation only as long as necessary, to measure her breath so as not to fight. The restaurant buzzed with the conversations of couples and groups of friends lingering over dinner. A young waiter placed bread and olive oil on the table with courtesy and wished them a pleasant evening. Eleanor thanked him with a sincere smile. Julian, in contrast, glanced at his phone before giving the waiter a brief look. Eleanor tried to keep the dinner cordial. She asked about his plans for September. She hinted that it would be nice to organize a simple meal with both their parents. She also proposed visiting her brother Arthur in New York City before the end of the month. Julian responded with generalities. He said his schedule was tight. He added that he did not know if he could make it. She nodded without reproach. She concentrated on eating slowly, on listening to the cadence of nearby voices, on ordering her thoughts. Halfway through dinner, Chloe Sterling appeared, elegant, flanked by two friends who were laughing naturally. They stopped to speak with the maitre d', and then moved toward the back of the room. Chloe recognized Julian and Eleanor. Her smile widened a notch, and she approached with a confident stride. She greeted them with a familiarity that aimed to seem casual. "Good evening," she said. "What a surprise to see you here, as if bumping into acquaintances in the same city where everyone crosses paths." Julian stood up rather quickly and returned her greeting with restrained politeness. Eleanor observed her without losing her calm, responding to the greeting with sober kindness and adding no questions. Chloe talked about the festival, how vibrant Boston was, and the work that kept her busy this season. Julian nodded at every phrase, his attention fixed on her eyes. Eleanor regulated the rhythm of her breathing to avoid being swept away by her discomfort. When Chloe retreated to her table, the tension left an echo that did not dissipate. Julian tried to resume the conversation with a superficial comment about the menu. Eleanor said she had already decided and mentioned the baby again. She recounted that the doctor recommended rest, avoiding stress, and maintaining a stable routine. Julian said he understood and ordered another drink. She felt as though they were speaking parallel languages. She took a small piece of bread, dipped it in oil, and drank some water. She looked around to remind herself that she was not alone in the world, that the city's life continued with its music and its essence, that the next day would arrive with its usual light. After a few minutes, Chloe returned. This time she came with a polite excuse. She said a friend of hers was an admirer of Julian's work and would be thrilled to say hello. She called over the friend, who smiled and introduced herself politely. There was a brief exchange. Eleanor remained present without intruding on the scene. She wanted no awkward scenes or bad manners. As she said goodbye, Chloe left her hand on Julian's forearm for a few seconds. He did not pull his arm away. Eleanor saw the gesture and decided not to react. She took a breath and smiled discreetly. She said the food was perfect and that everything was fine. She clung to that simplicity to preserve her evening. After the young women had moved away, Eleanor tried one last approach. She suggested that when they left, they take a short walk down a quiet street, perhaps a 10-minute stroll before going home. Julian said he was tired and would rather leave as soon as they were finished. She replied that, yes, that was no problem. She fell silent, and that silence did not empty her but sustained her with a serene dignity. She understood it was not the time to argue, that the beat of her own heart mattered more than any harsh phrase. She decided to finish dinner with composure. However, Chloe did not give up. She approached again, this time alone, with an apologetic smile. She said she had forgotten to ask about a professional matter that interested her and that it would not take more than a minute. Julian invited her to speak. Eleanor stepped back just enough to respect the privacy of a supposedly work-related conversation. She watched Chloe's lips as they formed words in a low voice. She also observed Julian's posture, his calculated proximity, the unsettling synchrony. Dinner continued around them, but for Eleanor, the world had shrunk to that small triangle of glances. When Chloe leaned in a little closer, the murmur of the room seemed to mask her phrase. It was not necessary to hear it to understand it. Chloe whispered in Julian's ear. She will never understand you the way I do. The sentence landed with brutal clarity. Eleanor did not hear the air, did not perceive the background music, did not register the clatter of dishes. She saw the shape of the words on Chloe's mouth and knew there was no benevolent interpretation possible. It was a precise, cold second. Julian did not pull away. He remained where he was, as if the phrase justified a decision made long ago. Eleanor felt that dignity was her only defense. She made no abrupt gesture, nor did she seek Chloe's gaze. She did not demand explanations in public. She caressed her belly with a short movement and straightened up. She calmly called the waiter and asked for the check. The young man approached quickly. She took out her wallet, paid her share, and added an appropriate tip. Julian left a small coin next to his portion with a distracted gesture. Eleanor observed him without saying anything. The contrast was a sharp photograph of his priorities. She stood up smoothly, looked at Julian, and told him she needed some air. He replied that he would meet her outside. Chloe moved away with a polite excuse and returned to her table with the faint satisfaction of a clean hit. Eleanor walked toward the exit with a steady pace. She did not need to look back. She knew that any attempt at conversation had been broken at the deepest level. The Boston night continued, and she, who had always defended calm, chose now to defend herself. At the door, she took 2 slow breaths. She thought of her child. She thought of what she had to protect. She thought of who would listen without judging her, with her best interests at heart. The decision formed on its own, mature and inevitable. Eleanor rose from the table with contained tears and decided she would soon have to speak with someone she trusted. The night had fallen over Boston with a strange silence, interrupted only by the distant echo of fireworks from the celebration. Eleanor stood in the living room, not daring to sit. Her body trembled with exhaustion, but her mind would not let her rest. She knew Julian would return, and also knew that this night would be different. Ever since she saw Chloe at the restaurant, everything had taken on a sinister hue. Her intuition screamed that something terrible was about to happen. She caressed her belly with both hands and murmured words of calm to her child. She promised to protect him, even if it meant facing a hurricane. Julian entered after midnight, slamming the door with a bang that reverberated through the entire penthouse. The sharp sound made Eleanor flinch. He advanced with firm steps, his eyes bloodshot, his jaw rigid. Eleanor tried to smile, to say good evening, but he did not even respond. He threw his jacket onto the sofa and looked at her with a crazed glint in his eyes. "You think I do not know?" he spat. Eleanor furrowed her brow, not understanding. Julian took a step toward her and raised an accusing finger. "You and your brother Arthur, always together, always plotting behind my back. You laugh at me in front of everyone. Do you think I am an idiot?" Eleanor took a step back, her heart racing. She shook her head and spoke softly. She said she loved him, that the only thing that mattered to her was the baby's well-being, but he was not listening. His fury consumed him. The argument became a torrent. Julian accused her of disloyalty, of deceit, of being the cause of everything crumbling in his life. Eleanor tried to stay calm, but every word she spoke was returned like a dart. "You have destroyed me!" Julian shouted, slamming his fist on the table so hard the wood vibrated. Eleanor trembled, clutching her belly in desperation. She tried to approach him to stop him, but he pushed her away roughly. She nearly lost her balance, managing to catch herself on the edge of the sofa. A shiver ran down her spine as she saw his dark eyes shining with rage. Then, in a fit of rage, Julian grabbed an antique mahogany walking stick that was leaning in the corner. He raised it in the air with blind fury. Eleanor raised her hands, pleading with him to think of their child, but Julian, dominated by anger, brought the stick down on her arm. The blow was sharp, brutal. A heart-wrenching scream escaped Eleanor's throat. She felt a sharp pain shoot through her body and fell to her knees on the floor. She curled up, protecting her belly with her entire being, while hot tears streamed down her face. "Julian, stop, please," she begged. But he did not stop. He took another step, raised the stick again, and brought it down violently against the back of the sofa, inches from her head. The crash was terrifying. Eleanor closed her eyes, convinced the next blow would land on her. For a moment, silence filled the room. Julian was breathing heavily, sweating, the stick still in his hand. Eleanor, her arm aching and her heart pounding, looked up. She saw something in her husband's eyes worse than rage: indifference. There was no compassion, no regret, only an emptiness that left her cold. He murmured in a low, sharp voice, "Chloe was right. You will never understand me. It will never be enough." The words fell like knives. Eleanor felt the world sink beneath her feet. She understood this was not just a mistake of one night. It was a betrayal that had been brewing for some time. The physical blow had hurt, but those phrases pierced her deeper. Through her tears, Eleanor got up as best she could. Her body trembled, but her eyes no longer reflected fear, but a dawning determination. "You have lost me, Julian," she said in a broken voice. He laughed with disdain, letting the stick fall to the floor. He walked toward his home office and slammed the door. Eleanor was left alone, the echo of his laughter seared into her soul. For long minutes, she could not move. She caressed her belly again and again, making sure the baby was still there, alive, resisting. She felt relief when she noticed a faint movement. Then, her sadness transformed into courage. She could not allow her child to grow up in such darkness. She had to act, and soon. She slowly got up and walked to the bedroom. She turned on the light and looked at herself in the mirror. She saw her tear-streaked face, her disheveled hair, her bruised arm. And yet, behind that broken image, she discovered another. A woman who refused to surrender. She remembered her brother Arthur's words years ago when he had comforted her over a minor problem. Never forget who you are. Our family always gets back up, no matter what. That memory gave her strength. She knew in that instant that she had to go to him. Arthur would be the only one who could listen to her, protect her, and remind her that she was not alone. With trembling hands, she packed a small bag, putting in documents, some clothes, and the little blue blanket she had bought for the baby. She hid it under the bed, as if keeping that secret were a first step toward freedom. Then she returned to the living room. The walking stick was still on the floor, a silent witness to the violence. She looked at it with contained rage and decided she would never again allow that object to threaten her. She bent down, picked it up, and took it to the back door of the penthouse. She left it outside on the terrace, under the light rain that had begun to fall. As she closed the door, she felt she had thrown away a piece of her fear. Eleanor sat for a moment in the darkness, breathing deeply. The echo of the celebration lingered in the distance, a cruel reminder that the world was celebrating while her life was breaking apart. But through her tears, she smiled bitterly. She knew this night was not an end, but the beginning of a fight, and she had already decided on her next step. To talk to Arthur, to tell him everything, to expose the lies and the violence and ask for help. For the first time in a long time, she did not feel shame, she felt courage. She lay down with difficulty, her arms still sore. She closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to engrave a promise in her mind. She caressed her belly and whispered in a firm voice, "I will never leave you in the hands of his fury. Tomorrow, we are going to see your Uncle Arthur. We will not be alone anymore." The echo of her own voice brought her peace. The decision was made. With a broken heart, but ignited with courage, Eleanor understood that the next battle would be harder than all the previous ones. Julian had already crossed a line of no return, and she, with her child in her womb, had sworn never to be silent again. The dawn in Boston brought a cold air that seeped through the windows. Eleanor had spent the night awake, caressing her belly, and replaying what had happened over and over. Every time she remembered the blow, the scream, and Julian's bitter laugh, a knot formed in her throat. There were no more doubts. She had to talk to Arthur, her brother, before fear became a habit. She dressed calmly, packed a small bag with essentials, and left the penthouse without waking Julian, who was still shut in his office. With every step toward the street, she felt she was moving a little further from the chains that bound her. The city was waking up with its daily rhythm. The murmur of cafes opening early, the aroma of fresh bread, the voices of passers-by formed a backdrop that contrasted with the storm in Eleanor's heart. She walked to South Station with determination. She bought a train ticket to New York City, where Arthur lived. The journey was long, but Eleanor spent it in silence, looking out the window and caressing her belly. In every reflection in the glass, she saw herself firmer, less willing to yield. She thought about what she would say, how she would tell the truth, without hiding anything. For the first time in a long time, she felt free to speak. Arthur met her at the door of his apartment with a mixture of surprise and concern. They had not seen each other in weeks, and Eleanor's expression spoke for itself. He hugged her tightly, noticing her trembling. "What happened?" he asked in a grave voice. Eleanor took a few seconds to answer. She sat on the sofa, took a breath, and began to tell him everything. Julian's looks with Chloe, the distance at the festival, the arguments, and finally, the brutal assault the previous night. Her voice broke at times, but she did not stop. Arthur listened in silence, his eyes fixed on her, his brow furrowed and his fists clenched. When Eleanor finished, a heavy silence filled the room. Arthur took a deep breath and stood up. He paced for a few moments, trying to contain his anger. "I cannot believe Julian did this to you," he said finally. "That man does not deserve to be called a husband. And Chloe, playing with your pain. I will not allow this." Eleanor looked at him with tears in her eyes. "I do not want revenge, Arthur. I just want to protect my child and find peace. I cannot go on like this." Arthur knelt in front of her, took her hands, and spoke firmly. "You are not alone. I promise you. The family is with you. We are going to find a way out." Arthur's promise gave Eleanor a spark of hope. For years she had feared bearing this weight in silence, but now she felt the wall of loneliness breaking. Arthur suggested she stay in New York for a few days under his protection. Eleanor accepted. She knew Julian would not suspect immediately, and the distance would give her time to think about her next steps. They spent the afternoon talking. Arthur reminded her of moments from their childhood, the strength of their parents, the courage they had always shown in difficult times. Those words were a balm for Eleanor, who gradually regained her self-confidence. As night fell, Arthur received a call from a colleague who knew Julian well in the business world. He told him that rumors about him and Chloe were already circulating in the city, that many had seen overly intimate gestures between them. Eleanor felt a shiver. It was not just her perception. Julian's betrayal was public, and everyone was talking about it. Arthur, his face hardened, clenched his teeth. "This will not stand, but first, we are going to protect you. Tomorrow we will talk to a trusted lawyer. We need to get everything on record for you and the baby." Eleanor nodded. She understood the road was just beginning, but having a plan gave her room to breathe. Later, while Arthur was preparing dinner, Eleanor stepped out onto the balcony, looked at the lights of New York, and let the cold wind hit her face. She thought of Julian and how he had changed. She remembered the man who had wooed her, who had promised her care and tenderness. That man no longer existed. What remained was a stranger capable of raising a stick against her. She felt rage, but also relief for having taken the step to escape. She caressed her belly again and whispered, "We are safe now. I promise I will never expose you to that darkness again." The night passed in long conversations with Arthur. They spoke of their childhood, their mother's strength, the times they had overcome adversity together. Eleanor listened intently, feeling that these stories wove a bridge between her past and the future she wanted to build for her son. Arthur insisted that what mattered was not what she had lost, but what she could still save, her dignity, her freedom, and the family that would always be by her side. Every word was a firm stone on the new path Eleanor was beginning to walk. Before she went to sleep, Arthur looked at her seriously. "Tomorrow will be a long day. You need to be ready to tell everything clearly. But remember, you are not to blame. You are the victim, and your strength will be your greatest defense." Eleanor nodded with contained tears, lay down in the guest bed, and closed her eyes. The pain was still there, but for the first time in a long time, she felt she was not alone in the darkness. Across the hall, her brother was watching over her. That certainty was enough to find a restless but determined sleep. The next dawn would bring new challenges, but Eleanor no longer feared facing them. She had broken the silence. She had shared the truth with someone who truly loved her. And now, with Arthur by her side, she knew that the fight for her dignity was just beginning. The dawn in New York City brought an air of nervousness to Arthur's home. Eleanor had barely slept, but the determination to take the next step kept her on her feet. She had spent the night mentally reviewing every detail of what had happened with Julian, ready to recount it with precision to whoever was necessary. Arthur, ever protective, had already contacted a trusted lawyer, a serious and experienced man named James Morrison, who agreed to see them that same day at his office. The idea of speaking with an outsider frightened her, but it also brought relief. It was time to create a record, to bring into the light what had remained in the shadows. Upon arriving at the office, Eleanor felt the weight of every step. James greeted them cordially, though he immediately noticed the tension on her face. Arthur spoke first, briefly explaining the situation. Then, Eleanor recounted in detail what her life had been like in recent weeks, the knowing glances between Julian and Chloe, the cold comments, the lack of support, and finally, the attack with the walking stick. As she spoke, her voice broke at times, but she did not stop. James listened attentively, taking notes, nodding occasionally. When Eleanor finished, a deep silence fell. The lawyer took a deep breath and spoke firmly. "You have a clear case of domestic violence and abuse. What your husband has done cannot go unpunished. You need immediate legal protection." Eleanor looked down, her tears held in check. She did not see herself as strong, but hearing that she had the right to defend herself was a respite. James explained the legal steps, formally reporting the assault, requesting a restraining order, and preparing evidence to prove both the violence and the public infidelity. Arthur interjected harshly, saying he was fed up with Julian's abuse and was willing to testify to whatever was necessary. Eleanor, her voice trembling, confessed that what she feared most was Julian using his financial power to silence her. James looked her in the eyes and assured her she would not be alone, that the justice system still had ways to protect her. After the meeting, Eleanor left with the feeling of having taken a giant step. She walked beside Arthur down the street, her heart pounding but feeling lighter. She felt supported and understood. However, she also knew her decision would have consequences. Julian would not stand by idly. Arthur knew this and insisted she must remain under his care. Eleanor nodded, caressed her belly, and thought of the baby as a source of courage. It was not just about her. Every step she took was also for the life growing inside her. That same afternoon, Arthur received an unexpected call. It was a business associate who told him that Julian had appeared in public with Chloe at an event in Boston without hiding their relationship. The news was already circulating in certain social circles, and everyone was commenting on the businessman's shamelessness. Eleanor overheard the conversation and felt a mixture of anger and sadness. There was no doubt. Julian had not only betrayed her in private, but now he was humiliating her publicly. Arthur hung up, his face hardened. That man has crossed every line. Now the truth will prevail. I promise you. Eleanor, though hurt, felt that each new humiliation was more evidence to support her complaint. That night, as they had dinner together, Arthur reminded her again of the importance of staying strong. He told her she could not waver, that her dignity and her son's were at stake. Eleanor nodded, a glint of determination in her eyes. She had gone from being a broken woman to one who was beginning to rise. She remembered the fear of the previous night, the pain in her arm, and compared that image with the strength she now felt being with her brother. It was as if she had been reborn in a matter of hours. Before going to sleep, Eleanor received a text message on her phone. It was from Julian. His words were cold and calculated. "I know where you are. Do not think you can run from me." Eleanor's heart leaped, but instead of freezing, she immediately sought out Arthur. She showed him the message, and he, enraged, promised that they would present it as evidence to the lawyer the next day. "This is no longer just a betrayal. It is a direct threat, and he will pay for it." Eleanor hugged her brother and let the tears flow, not of fear, but of liberation. She knew the fight was just beginning, but for the first time, she felt ready to face it. That night, Eleanor prayed silently before sleeping. She did not ask for everything to go back to how it was, because she understood that past was already lost. Instead, she prayed for the strength to resist, clarity to make the right decisions, and protection for her son. With her heart still wounded but stronger than ever, she closed her eyes, knowing that the next dawn would mark a new chapter. She was no longer the woman subjected to silence. Now she was a mother willing to do anything for her son, and a sister who had found in her family the strength to fight. As she drifted off to sleep, Eleanor understood that the real battle had not yet arrived, but she was determined to fight it, even if it meant facing Julian head-on and enduring his threats, because deep down, she knew she had already crossed a point of no return. The next morning dawned gray in New York, as if the sky aligned with the tension Eleanor carried in her chest. Arthur accompanied her to James Morrison's office, determined not to leave her side for a moment. Eleanor had slept little, but the resolve to protect her child gave her strength. As they walked down the street, she mentally reviewed the blows, the hurtful words, and the threatening message Julian had sent. It was all painful, but at the same time, it transformed into fuel not to give up. James received them with gravity. "Today we file the report," he said without preamble. Eleanor sat across from him, took a deep breath, and began to recount what had happened in detail. She explained the scene at the festival, the glances with Chloe, the escalating arguments, the violence in their living room, and the blow from the walking stick that still ached in her arm. Then she showed him the message Julian had sent the night before. James noted everything, reviewed the evidence, and assured her it was enough to open a case. "We will have to move quickly because Julian will try to use his influence, but the clearer we are, the harder it will be for him to manipulate the situation." With Arthur's support, Eleanor then went to the police station. There, she filed the official complaint. The process was cold, but every word Eleanor spoke was like lifting a weight from her back. She repeated to the officer the same story she had told the lawyer. This time, though her voice trembled, she did not look away. She was determined to be silent no longer. Arthur remained by her side, supporting her with a steady gaze. Upon leaving, Eleanor felt that something had changed. The fear was still there, but now it shared space with a sense of recovered dignity. That same afternoon, James called them in again. He had disturbing news. Julian has already found out about the complaint, he explained, and as we expected, he is trying to pull strings to discredit you. He is saying you are making up stories out of jealousy and that your brother is manipulating you. He is even trying to use Chloe as a witness in his favor. Eleanor clenched her hands tightly. She knew Julian would not stop. Arthur slammed the table in anger, vowing he would not let her be slandered. James urged them to be calm and strategic. The court will not judge rumors. It will judge evidence, and we have the evidence. That night at Arthur's home, the atmosphere was tense. Eleanor barely touched her food at dinner. Her mind replayed the image of Julian raising the walking stick, his cold smile after the blow, and now his attempt to portray himself as the victim. She felt vulnerable, but also more convinced that she could not back down. As she caressed her belly, she thought that her child deserved a strong mother, a mother capable of facing the monster his father had become. Amid that silence, Arthur reminded her of something important. Do not forget that you are not alone. I will be at every hearing, and our parents will support you too if necessary. Blood is thicker than fear. Eleanor looked at him with gratitude. She felt that her family was the only light in that dark tunnel. She promised not to betray that trust. The next day brought the first surprise. A local journalist called Arthur's phone asking for Eleanor. Someone had leaked the complaint. The news was already circulating in certain circles, mixed with rumors about Julian and Chloe. Eleanor felt a chill, imagining her life exposed in the media. James, upon hearing the news, reassured them. This could work in our favor. Public opinion sometimes protects more than the law. Do not be ashamed, Eleanor. The truth is your best defense. She understood that a scandal was inevitable. For the first time, she decided not to hide. That afternoon, while resting in Arthur's living room, she received another threat from Julian on her phone. If you do not drop the complaint, you will regret it. Eleanor did not break down. She walked with a firm step to her brother and showed him the message. Arthur, furious, wanted to reply immediately, but Eleanor stopped him. No, let it be recorded. Every word he says will be more evidence against him. Arthur looked at her, surprised. Eleanor was no longer the fearful woman who had arrived at his door. She was a woman who had learned to transform pain into courage. James, upon seeing the message, decided to include it in the evidence file. This clearly demonstrates his attempt at intimidation. No judge can ignore it. Eleanor nodded. Inside, she felt fear, yes, but at the same time, a strength she had never felt before. She had discovered that true courage was not the absence of fear, but acting in spite of it. That night, as she prepared for bed, Eleanor looked at herself in the mirror. She saw the mark still visible on her arm, but she also saw a different fire in her eyes. She remembered every humiliation, every tear, and understood that those memories no longer chained her but pushed her forward. She caressed her belly and spoke in a low voice. My child, the worst is over. What comes next will be difficult, but we will not be alone. Your uncle, your family, and I will fight for you. I will never let your father's darkness touch you. When she lay down in bed, for the first time in a long time, she felt sleep come with a relative peace. The process was just beginning. The legal battles would be tough. Julian's threats would continue, but Eleanor had already taken the most important steps: reporting, confronting, and not yielding to fear. In the silence of the New York night, she understood that the war would not be quick, but she also knew she had already made the decision to win it, whatever the cost. The dawn of that day brought a strange silence, heavy with foreboding. Eleanor woke up in Arthur's apartment with her heart racing. She had slept for only a few hours, yet she knew she would have to gather all her strength. That day was the first preliminary hearing to review her complaint. James Morrison had already warned that Julian would try to discredit her with every resource at his disposal. Eleanor dressed simply, caressed her belly, and repeated softly that she was not alone. Arthur, ever steadfast, walked her to the door. Before leaving, he said, "Whatever happens, remember that the truth is your shield." The Boston courthouse was filled with murmurs when Eleanor arrived. Some journalists had shown up, drawn by the rumors circulating about Julian and Chloe. Cameras tried to capture any gesture from the woman who had dared to report an influential businessman. Eleanor felt the stares on her, but she took a deep breath and held her head high. Beside her, Arthur walked like a guardian, his gaze fixed ahead. James met her at the entrance, quickly reviewed the documents, and whispered for her to speak clearly, without fear, because every word mattered. The courtroom was cold. Julian was already there, sitting next to his lawyer. He was dressed elegantly, but his eyes held a mix of rage and calculation. When he saw Eleanor enter, he offered a wry smile, as if he had already won the battle. Chloe, to everyone's surprise, was sitting behind him with a look of false serenity. Eleanor swallowed hard but did not lower her gaze. She sat across from the judge, aware that this moment would mark a before and an after. The judge called for order and began the session. Julian's lawyer spoke first with a confident tone. He painted Eleanor as a jealous woman, influenced by her brother Arthur, and claimed the complaint was nothing more than an attempt to damage the reputation of a successful man. He presented Chloe as a witness, implying she had been harassed by Eleanor's hostility. Every word was a stab, but Eleanor remained motionless. Inside she was burning, outside she projected dignity. Arthur clenched his fists, restraining himself from interrupting. When it was her turn, Eleanor took a deep breath and stood up. Her voice trembled at first, but soon found its firmness. She recounted the facts in detail. The arguments, the glances at the festival, the dinner interrupted by Chloe, the insults, the blow from the walking stick on her arm, and the threatening message she still had on her phone. She spoke without embellishment, without shouting, with the serenity of someone who has nothing left to hide. The judge listened attentively, and some in the room shifted uncomfortably at the rawness of her account. Eleanor took out her phone, showed Julian's message, and submitted it as evidence. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Chloe was called to testify. With a feigned smile, she tried to support Julian's version. She said it was all a misunderstanding, that she was just a friend, and that Eleanor had reacted with insecurity. But in a slip-up, while answering a question from the judge, she let it be known that she had been in frequent contact with Julian at unusual hours. Eleanor's lawyer seized on the contradiction, pointing out that this detail confirmed the extramarital affair. The color drained from Chloe's face, and the murmuring in the room grew louder. Julian, in an outburst, stood up and shouted that it was all a farce, that Eleanor was destroying him out of spite. The judge banged his gavel, demanding silence. Eleanor, with tears welling in her eyes, looked directly at him and replied calmly, "It is not spite, it is dignity. And it is my child's life that I am protecting." Her words resonated in the room with a force that no legal argument could match. For a moment, even the journalists stopped writing. The hearing ended with the judge's decision to keep the investigation open and issue a restraining order to protect Eleanor. Julian could not approach her until further notice. It was a hard blow for him. As he left the courtroom, his anger was visible in every gesture. Chloe followed him closely, but even she seemed less confident than before. Eleanor, however, left supported by Arthur and James, her heart pounding, but with a new sense of relief. She had spoken, she had been heard, and for the first time, justice seemed to be on her side. Back at the apartment, Arthur did not stop congratulating her on her bravery. James insisted that this was only the beginning, and they needed to prepare for new legal battles. Eleanor, exhausted, sank onto the sofa, but despite her fatigue, a spark of hope shone in her eyes. She had faced the man who abused her, she had unmasked him in front of everyone, and she had survived. That night, Eleanor lay in bed and caressed her belly tenderly. She remembered the words she spoke before the judge. "It is my child's life that I am protecting." In that moment, she understood she was not just fighting Julian. She was building a different future, a future where violence would have no place. She closed her eyes with tears of gratitude and exhaustion, knowing there was still a long way to go, but convinced that there was no turning back. The battle had begun, and she had no intention of ever surrendering. The morning after the hearing, Eleanor woke with a tired body, but renewed determination. The echo of her words before the judge still resonated in her mind. She knew she had taken an important step, but she also sensed that Julian would not accept defeat easily. While having breakfast with Arthur, she received a call from James Morrison. The lawyer explained that Julian had pulled strings in Boston to spread the idea that Eleanor was unwell, that she suffered from emotional instability, and that the complaint was a result of her hysteria. Eleanor pressed her lips together in anger. He had not only hit her, now he was trying to destroy her credibility in front of the world. Arthur slammed his fist on the table. That man never tires of digging himself deeper. Eleanor, we will not let him tarnish your name. She took a deep breath and nodded. She knew it was time to show more strength than ever. James suggested a controlled interview with a reputable media outlet to expose the truth and neutralize Julian's campaign. The idea frightened Eleanor. She did not want her private life to become a spectacle, but she understood that silence meant letting Julian control the narrative. After some thought, she agreed. The following afternoon, an experienced journalist met with Eleanor and Arthur in the apartment. The conversation was intimate. Eleanor calmly recounted what had happened. The public humiliation, the blow with the stick, the threatening text messages. She used no shouts or drama. She spoke like a mother who only wanted to protect her child. Arthur intervened to confirm every detail and vouch for his sister's integrity. The journalist, moved, promised to publish the story with rigor. When she left, Eleanor felt fear, but also relief. She had placed the truth in the hands of someone who could disseminate it. The next day, the article was published. The headlines highlighted Eleanor's courage and the complaint against Julian. The story included excerpts from the threatening messages and Arthur's testimony. All of Boston began to murmur. In cafes, at markets, and in public squares, people discussed the news. Many expressed outrage. Others, still incredulous, could not believe that a man so respected publicly was capable of such violence. Opinion was divided, but what Eleanor had feared happened. No one could pretend they did not know what was going on anymore. Julian reacted with fury. That same afternoon, he sent his lawyer to demand that Eleanor retract her statements. He also appeared on a local radio station, claiming his wife was being manipulated by Arthur and that he was the real victim. Eleanor listened to the recordings with a mix of anger and sadness, but instead of breaking, her resolve hardened. "There is no going back now," she told Arthur. "I will confront every lie he tells. I will not let him steal the truth from my son." That night at the apartment, Eleanor received an unexpected visit from her parents. They came worried, as the whole neighborhood was talking about the scandal. Her mother hugged her tenderly, crying at seeing her so thin and tense. Her father, a man of few words, looked at her gravely and said, "Daughter, you are doing the right thing. The shame is not yours, it is his." Eleanor burst into tears upon hearing that sentence. She had feared for days that her family would judge her, but instead, she found them by her side, giving her strength. That unity restored her lost confidence. In the following days, the pressure mounted. Julian sent people to watch her, trying to intimidate her. Eleanor noticed it on the street, in the strange looks, in the footsteps she felt behind her when she went out to buy something. Arthur reacted immediately, reporting the surveillance to the police. James collected every piece of evidence to strengthen the complaint. Eleanor lived in fear, but also with the certainty that every move Julian made was sinking him deeper. "He is showing everyone who he is," Arthur repeated to her. The tension reached a critical point when Julian appeared unannounced at the courthouse on the same day Eleanor was due to submit new evidence. He tried to approach her, shouting that he wanted to talk to her. Security guards stopped him, reminding him of the restraining order. Eleanor saw him from a distance, his eyes wild and his voice filled with rage. For a moment, she felt her legs might give way, but Arthur held her arm, and she regained her balance. Instead of fleeing, she walked with her head held high toward the entrance, showing that she would not yield to fear. Inside, she submitted more evidence: the recent threatening messages, the contradictions in Chloe's statements, and a medical report confirming the bruise on her arm. The judge received everything with gravity. Eleanor left the courtroom exhausted but certain that her case was growing stronger. Arthur smiled at her with pride. "Today you showed that you are not just a victim, you are a fighter." Eleanor hugged him with tears held back. That night, back at home, Eleanor reflected on the journey she had taken. She had gone from silence and pain to raising her voice and meeting the gaze of those who doubted her. There was still much to face, but she was no longer the broken woman who was afraid to speak. She was a mother and a sister who had found her most powerful weapon in the truth and in her family. As she caressed her belly, she promised her son that every tear shed would turn into strength, and that together they would reach the end of this storm with their heads held high. The dawn of that day brought an air thick with tension, as if Boston itself knew what was about to happen. Eleanor woke up early, her stomach churning with anxiety. This was the day of the key hearing where new evidence and witnesses would be presented and where the judge might decide on definitive measures against Julian. Arthur was waiting for her in the kitchen with coffee and a firm look. "Today, you are not alone. Whatever happens, I will be with you," he said. Eleanor nodded silently, caressing her belly as if drawing strength from the life within her. At James Morrison's office, the lawyer reviewed the final details. They had managed to get a neighbor to testify, as she had heard screams and thuds from Julian and Eleanor's penthouse that night. A psychological report would also be presented, refuting the accusations of instability that Julian had spread. Eleanor listened attentively, trying to memorize every word so as not to be swept away by fear. Arthur watched her constantly, making sure she did not waver. James concluded with a phrase that gave them hope. "Today, we can change the course of all of this." The courtroom was packed. Journalists, onlookers, and family acquaintances had gathered. Eleanor felt their gazes weighing on her skin, but she stood tall. Julian was already there, sitting with an expression of arrogance, surrounded by lawyers, with Chloe nearby, though this time she was much more nervous. The tension was palpable. When Eleanor took her seat, he shot her a look filled with hatred. She held his gaze, remembering everything she had been through, and decided she would never look down again. The session began with the neighbor's testimony. The woman recounted hearing Eleanor scream and cry, followed by a sharp thud. She recognized Julian's voice, insulting and threatening. Her testimony was firm and clear. Julian's lawyer tried to discredit her, calling her a nosy neighbor, but the woman responded with composure, exposing the aggressiveness of his strategy. Eleanor felt a mix of gratitude and relief seeing her hold her ground. Arthur, from the front row, breathed a little easier. Next came the psychological report. The specialist explained that Eleanor showed no signs of emotional instability, but rather symptoms of anxiety derived from the violence she had suffered. His words dismantled the narrative Julian had tried to impose. Julian lost his composure, muttering angrily to his lawyer, which caught the judge's attention. Inside, Eleanor felt the scales slowly begin to balance. The most tense moment came when Chloe was called to testify again. At first, she maintained her supportive version for Julian, but under James's sharp questioning, she began to contradict herself. She stumbled over dates and times and ended up admitting she had been in constant contact with Julian, even on the night of the incident. The judge looked at her sternly, and some in the room began to murmur. Chloe, visibly nervous, lowered her voice and avoided everyone's gaze. A furious Julian slammed the table and was immediately reprimanded. Eleanor was called to give her final words. She rose slowly, her heart pounding. Her voice, though filled with emotion, came out clear. "I am not here for revenge. I am here because I want to live in peace. Because I want my son to be born into a world where he does not have to fear his own father. I am not asking for pity. I am asking for justice." Her words filled the room with a reverent silence. Many of those present looked down, moved by the honesty of her statement. Arthur, his eyes shining, had never been prouder of his sister. The judge, after hearing all the evidence and testimony, announced he would impose stricter measures against Julian. The restraining order was upheld, and a formal criminal case for domestic violence would be opened. Julian reacted violently, shouting that it was all a conspiracy, that Eleanor and Arthur had destroyed him with lies. The bailiffs forced him out of the courtroom as he hurled insults. The scene was chaotic, but it was clear to everyone who had lost control. As Eleanor left the courthouse, she was surrounded by journalists. This time, she did not lower her head. With a firm voice, she declared, "Today, I speak not just for myself, but for all women who are afraid. You can break the silence. You can find strength in family." Arthur took her arm and guided her to the car, while James answered legal questions. Eleanor's heart felt light, though she knew the worst was not yet over. The legal battle would continue, but that day she had won a crucial part: her self-respect and public credibility. Back at the apartment, Eleanor collapsed onto the sofa. Arthur hugged her and told her how proud he was. James assured them the case now had a solid foundation, and the chances of a final victory were high. Eleanor smiled faintly, exhausted but hopeful. She caressed her belly and whispered, "My son, every day we are closer to freedom." That night she slept deeply, certain that the road ahead was long but that she had crossed the point of no return. She would never again be the same quiet, fearful woman. Now, she was someone who had learned to fight for herself and for those she loved. The dawn of the trial's final day arrived with a heavy air, but Eleanor greeted it with serenity. She had spent sleepless nights, faced humiliation, threats, and smear campaigns, but now she was one step away from closing a painful chapter. Arthur joined her for breakfast, looking at her with pride. "Today, your future is written," he said. Eleanor nodded and caressed her belly. She felt she was speaking not only for herself, but also for the life she carried within. James arrived shortly after with a briefcase full of documents. "Everything is ready," he assured them, though his eyes also held a certain tension. The courtroom was more crowded than ever. Neighbors, journalists, and curious onlookers packed the room. The atmosphere was electric. Julian appeared with his head held high, but his expression betrayed a wounded pride. Chloe was not with him. After the contradictions of the previous hearing, she had vanished from the scene, leaving Julian increasingly isolated. When Eleanor saw him enter, she felt no fear. She looked at him calmly, knowing he no longer had power over her. Arthur, beside her, leaned in and whispered, "He has already lost, even if he does not know it yet." The hearing began with a review of the final evidence. James once again presented the threatening messages, the medical and psychological reports, and the witness statements. Everything fit together like a puzzle, revealing Julian's true face. His lawyer, increasingly nervous, tried to object, but his words lacked force. The judge listened attentively, noting every detail. Sitting there, Eleanor felt that each piece of evidence was another brick in the wall separating her from her abuser. The most anticipated moment came when the judge asked Julian to speak. Julian stood up, his face contorted. At first, he tried to appear calm, claiming it was all a conspiracy by Eleanor and Arthur to destroy his reputation, but soon his voice rose. He began shouting that Eleanor was a liar, that she was crazy, that their child was not even his. The entire room held its breath. Eleanor remained firm, though his words pierced her chest like knives. Arthur stood up immediately, ready to defend her, but the judge demanded silence. What Julian failed to understand was that his own outburst was condemning him. The judge, in a stern voice, interrupted, "Mr. Hayes, this court will not tolerate any more insults. The evidence is clear. The violence perpetrated against Eleanor Vance has been proven." The room erupted in murmurs. Julian tried to interrupt, but the bailiff stopped him. Eleanor felt a wave of relief. Finally, someone in authority was drawing a line. The judge continued, "A permanent restraining order is hereby issued, and a criminal case will be opened on charges of domestic violence and making threats." Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment. She had dreamed so many times of hearing those words that they now seemed almost unreal. Arthur squeezed her hand tightly. James smiled discreetly, knowing they had reached a point of no return. Julian, beside himself, was escorted out of the courtroom, shouting insults and vowing revenge. That image, far from frightening Eleanor, confirmed that the judge's decision had been just. When they left the courthouse, a crowd was waiting. Journalists surrounded Eleanor, firing questions. With a firm voice, she declared, "Today is not just my victory. It is a victory for all women who suffer in silence. I want them to know they are not alone, that they can speak out, that they can find support, and that family, true love, will always be stronger than violence. Her words were captured by cameras and microphones and would soon spread across the country. Arthur, proudly, added that their family bond had been key to their endurance. The following days were strange. Eleanor returned to her life in Boston, but no longer as the fearful woman who had fled, but as someone who had faced her demons. People looked at her with respect. Some approached to congratulate her, others to ask for advice. She responded with humility, aware that her story could inspire others. Arthur accompanied her every step of the way, and her parents, though discreet, offered their full support. One afternoon, while walking through the public garden, Eleanor stopped to watch the children running among the swan boats. She caressed her belly and smiled. She knew the future would not be easy, that Julian would still try to find legal loopholes to attack her, but she also knew she was no longer alone. She had reclaimed her voice, her dignity, and above all, the certainty that she could build a different life. In that moment, she understood that the true triumph was not Julian's defeat, but the rebirth of her own strength. A final meeting with James and Arthur at their usual cafe closed the chapter. The lawyer assured them that the criminal proceedings would continue, but the protective measures were solid. Arthur raised his cup and made a toast. To the end of a dark era, and to the beginning of a new life. Eleanor smiled through her tears. She allowed herself to dream out loud. I want my son to grow up in a home full of love, not fear, and I know that with you by my side, that will be possible. That night, upon returning home, Eleanor looked at herself in the mirror. She no longer saw the wounded woman, but someone who had survived and transformed pain into strength. She hugged Arthur and thanked him for never letting go of her hand. Later, as she lay down, she whispered a promise to her son. I will never let the darkness touch us again. This is our new life. And with that certainty, she closed her eyes, leaving the past behind to embrace a future where love and family would be the true victory. In the final moments of the story, when the courtroom fell silent and the echo of the judge's decision still hung in the air, it was not Julian's harsh words or the press rumors that remained in the memory of those who had followed Eleanor's journey, but the calm with which she left the building, arm in arm with her brother. That simple image, a woman who had found her voice after so much pain, became the real victory. The faces of those who watched her understood that it had not been just a trial, but a journey of transformation, where shame turned into dignity and fear into strength. The deepest lesson of this story is not only the bravery of a woman who stood up to violence, but the certainty that family can be the refuge that sustains us even in the darkest storms. Eleanor could not have taken each step without Arthur's steady hand, nor without the silent gaze of her parents, who ultimately reminded her that shared blood weighs more than the hurtful words of a man blinded by power. In that family bond lies the key to rebirth. It is not enough to survive. It is necessary to rebuild with love and the will, not to repeat the mistakes of the past, because everyone, at some point in life, can fail or be hurt, but the possibility always remains to correct one's course and offer those we love a different kind of home. Time, which never stops, eventually shows that true strength is not found in shouting the loudest or accumulating the most wealth, but in learning to ask for forgiveness, extending a hand, and choosing a new path. This is the silent lesson of this journey. Just like a church bell that marks the hours without stridency, constant love and sincere loyalty patiently illuminate the grayest days and guide us toward lasting peace. Redemption and the power of family are not written with grand gestures, but with the constancy of those who do not turn away in difficult times. Perhaps now, upon hearing this story, each person can look around and recognize in a hug, a simple gesture, or a kind word that same power to heal that sustained Eleanor. Perhaps it is a good moment to pause for an instant and remember that the warmth of family and true affection is always closer than we imagine. And if this story has touched the heart of the one who hears it, may it be shared like a piece of bread at the table or a memory on a summer afternoon, so that others may also find in it the certainty that even after the longest night, the sun always rises.